Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago. Good evening, the world. And we thank you again for tuning into our live stream and these special webcasts, which we started last week, dealing with the current situation in our country, namely the state of emergency. I'm yours truly, Richard I.K. Williams, and I'm the pastor of the Cathedral of Christian Excellence. And we started last week looking at this whole issue of the state of emergency and a biblical response, because we made a point, namely that there are many different points of views being expressed, much emotions, negative and positive, have been evoked, and our country is in a very tense place. And it requires us, as the salt of the earth, the Bible says that the church is the salt of the earth, the light of the world, that we must not remain silent. We must offer our 2 pence, and we must give a biblical perspective on this whole matter. If you're watching this broadcast by now, you would know that the curfew has been extended, the state of emergency has been extended to 3 months, and the curfew hours have been shortened from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. And we are seeking to give some more insight, understanding, and enlightenment on this whole matter. And so on the program with me this evening is a very esteemed member of our congregation. He has been with me for the past 15 years or more. Am I correct? 15? Yes, 15 years or more. He is an eminent attorney at law, Colin Selvon, and he practices with his wife, Mrs. Nicole Selvon, and they are making a difference in the field of law for the honor and glory of God. And so we have him here with us, and we're going to talk namely about the anti-gang legislation. We're going to talk about the detention of these young men, and it's I think 1,400 and counting, 1,477 and counting. And we're going to talk about some of the implications of this. And remember, our topic is a biblical response to the state of emergency. Colin, welcome to the program.
Pastor, it's nice to be here. For the viewing audience, it's nice to be here.
It's nice to be here.
It's nice to be here.
You're usually a man who's very articulate.
Yes.
Suddenly you run out of words.
Run out of words.
Good. Let's delve right into the whole matter. Talk to us a little bit about the anti-gang legislation and some of the tenets of it, how it is being applied. Read the situation, and perhaps you can even give your personal perspective on this whole matter.
Well, Pastor, very quickly, the anti-gang legislation for now can really only be viewed within the context of the state of emergency. Mm-hmm. The reason being is that it would have been only a day after it was proclaimed that the state of emergency was announced.
Let me see if I heard you right. Only a day after this legislation came officially into law.
Right.
That's what you say?
Yes. Okay. While it may have been tabled and passed in Parliament way back in April or sometime, it was only been proclaimed, mm-hmm. I believe, on the 16th or the 17th. I'm subject to correction, but that is my understanding. Mm-hmm. So that we only know the anti-gang legislation within the context of the state of emergency. Okay. And that is, of course, one of the criticisms of the legislation itself, mm-hmm. in that it has been bandied about, particularly by the leader of the opposition and others, that we ought to have perhaps given the legislation in itself an attempt to work itself in, mm-hmm. and see what would have been the effects of it outside the context of a state of emergency. Well,
it's interesting that you raise that point, because that's something that I wanted to get into immediately, because I listened to him when he gave his response to the actions of the government, and mm-hmm. he hammered away very, very articulately, in my view, at that whole issue of that this state of emergency was unnecessary, because the existing legislation was formulated to deal with such a matter as this. What are your views on that?
Well, the thing is that apart from the anti-gang legislation, of course, we have all of the ordinary laws, as it were, mm-hmm. To assist the government, the police, to maintain law and order. Mm-hmm. And effectively, if we take all of the laws cumulatively, we can very well make a good argument for making a greater effort to have the laws that we've put in place to protect us work instead of creating a state of emergency and using the state of emergency in effect as a sort of a band-aid for what is in effect a bigger problem.
A bigger problem.
We do have quite a lot of legislation that would in effect protect us. The anti-gang legislation is really just one of quite a number of legislation. So that the argument is that we ought to have, instead of calling the state of emergency, been applying the legislation and the law, the police force and all of these things to really work in tandem with the legislation that we have to really bring about the change that we need in terms of crime in the country.
Okay.
That is in effect.
Have you found that the eminent legal luminaries, so to speak, in our country, that they are of that opinion or that perspective or point of view that it's just a matter of having the courage or the will or the aptitude to enforce the laws to deal with the situation, or do you, or is it that there are some who argue strongly that this is the correct thing in terms of dealing with the legal framework?
Well, based on what I have been able to observe, I would think that there is not a sufficient cry or response from the quote-unquote legal luminaries to
namely law association.
The law association and certain perhaps senior counsels who would have a voice that people would listen to, the Criminal Bar Association and the like, that would perhaps educate the public in terms of the real effects of this legislation and other legislation within the context, as I say, of the state of emergency. So that I do not know, the lines seem to me have really been divided again as we continue to deal with the politics of the thing along racial lines and of course to a large extent along ethnic lines. And so that there has really not been a consensus coming out of the legal fraternity that speaks to a position one way or the other on this particular issue. I don't think there has been anything coming out of the legal fraternity.
And really there should have been some kind of legal response in terms of perhaps a civil debate or an engagement of the public to use this opportunity to educate the public concerning all of these things. Because, I mean, you set a precedent here now with, as you said, a state of emergency is called, and this new legislation is now implemented in a state of emergency, and we don't really know for sure how it would have worked, the implementation of the laws, that is, under quote unquote normal circumstances. That is correct. I would have had, of course, an opportunity to, relative to the anti-gang legislation, to assist persons in court. And it would have been my first experience. When I got the call relative to assisting someone, I was not myself familiar with the legislation. I quickly, of course, went to the High Court Library. I got a copy and I had a read of it. And immediately I had some real concerns about the legislation itself. When I got to the court and I had to be there present while the court pronounced on these young men in terms of the legislation, what they were charged for, they would have obviously been either charged for being a gang leader or a gang member. Yes. Right. And of course, one of the things in the act is that you're not entitled to bail for 120 days. A lot of people may not really know that. So that it is automatic. The magistrate has no discretion. You are not entitled to bail. Of course, I believe that if you are under 18, there is some discretion there regarding the magistrate granting bail. Okay. So that right away you would be detained
And of course, it lends itself to the argument that have been preferred by the politicians, the opposition, and stuff, as to why it is that we would have implemented this legislation as a sort of a stopgap measure, certainly to rid the community of the quote-unquote gang members and gang leaders. And at the end of the day, that is what the perception. When I got to the court and I saw the effect of the legislation, people being herded before the magistrate, and she in turn simply heard it was simply, to me, a corralling, a sort of herding together of like cattle. To be quite honest, I felt very much ill at ease in terms of what I was in fact observing.
And given the fact that most of the guys are of African descent, that exacerbates it even more in terms of the perception, that is.
Well, in terms of the perception.
We want to take a break right now, and we are going to come back shortly to continue this very interesting and thought-provoking discussion and on the topic of a biblical response to the present state of emergency. The Cathedral of Christian Excellence invites you to join us for our governmental gatherings, our services. We are one church in two locations. We are located at the corner of Abercrombie and Buena Vista Streets in St. Joseph, and you can join us there on Sunday mornings at 10:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. And you can join us in Point Fortin. We meet on Saturday evenings at 6:30 p.m. on Capdeville Main Road, Capdeville opposite Moses Trace. We are looking forward to you joining us. You won't regret it. Right, we are back. I'm yours truly, Richard I.K. Williams, the pastor of the Cathedral of Christian Excellence, and we are dealing with the subject of a biblical response to the state of emergency. And if you've just tuned in, thank you for your patronage, your support. You can give your comments. You can go on our Facebook page, the Cathedral of Christian Excellence International, and you can ask your questions, and we'll seek to give a very honest and politically incorrect response. With me is on the program is one of the young, bright legal minds, and I don't say that in terms of just using words, but I mean that and I'm also proud to say that he is a member of our congregation and one of our elders, and a faithful member at that, is Mr. Colin Selvon. And we've been talking, we were talking in the first segment, Colin, about the whole issue of the anti-gang legislation and how now you being personally involved in the situation, having to go and represent the interests of your client, and seeing visually seeing the effects of this law being practiced or implemented or invoked, namely in a state of emergency. I remember we were having a conversation which sparked my inviting you to come and join me, and you were talking about how difficult it is to prove prosecute somebody for being part of a gang, and how do you go about that, and the difficulty that the government would have in time to come. I want you to speak to that a little bit for me, please.
Well, I think we all would agree we want all the gang leaders and all the gang members to be thrown in jail.
Beyond the shadow of a doubt. We don't want them in the Hyatt.
Yes, we don't want them in the Hyatt. We don't want them at Woodbrook 1 and the like. So that we start off with that position. We are not against certainly of being rid of gangs and gang members and gang leaders. But it is, in fact, how it is done.
Yes, definitely.
In that sense. So that, yes, we in terms of the legislation itself, without going into the details, very simply put, it to me, and my understanding after reading the legislation and what the state would have to prove, I don't think that we have put in the prosecutorial framework or the foundation to really prove who is a gang leader, who is a gang member. It's very funny, actually, in the courts when these young men are brought before the courts and attorneys ask certain questions about disclosure and what's the name of the gang, who are the members, where the gang is, there's really no response. We spoke about the issue of perhaps racial profiling, because if it is that you really have no basis for holding these young men, and one of the indicators of the fact that there may be no basis is that they are held in grabs. In other words, wherever they can grab them and hold them together, they pick them up. It is not a selective, well thought out process based on intelligence, where I can come to 50 people and say on Oxford Street and wherever it is and say, you, or is your name X, is your name Y, we have information, you come, whoever. They can pull together and pull in, and that sort of lends itself to the idea that there is no intelligence really behind the way we pick up these young men. So that if there is no intelligence in terms of how we get these young men together and bring them before the court, there is only one way we can do it. We have to profile them. And how we profile them is by what they wear, where they are living, and to some extent it would seem by the statistics, by the color of their skin, young African men. So that beyond a doubt, unless there's anything or any proof that anybody can bring to me otherwise, there is a large measure of profiling in terms of getting these young men before the court. And that in itself, of course, cannot be right. It cannot be the way that we have to go. In terms of proving, how are we going to prove that someone is a gang member, except we do have the intelligence, of course, which I don't think we do. Gangs in America, you have history, we have books. I sit down on National Geographic and I could watch 12 hours of television on gangs.
That's right.
We have channels and you know, we have the signs, we have the colors, we have the information, we have the intelligence. And these people can't prove you're a gang member by the way you dress. And when they take the way you dress and they match it against what is the known information that they have, beyond a reasonable doubt, perhaps a jury or a judge can determine that you are a member of a gang.
But I suppose in that context, that it is not against the law to be a part of a gang, is it?
There are gang legislation all across the world. There's no law against being part of a group, right? But how we define and qualify gang member according to the Act, which is in itself a problem. 2 or more persons gathered for the purpose of committing a number of offenses which are in the schedule. But so that if you are come together for the purpose of committing a robbery, right, but you have to prove that you have committed a robbery. You have to prove the robbery. We have laws against robbery, but you still have to prove that apart from you being a gang member, you came together to commit a particular offense. You must prove the offense, whether it's rape, robbery, kidnapping, extortion. You still have to prove it. There's a lot of difficulty.
So in essence, what you're saying is that after the 120 days, the government may have, maybe the word nightmare is too strong of a word, but I'll use it, a legal nightmare.
Nightmare is not too strong of a word.
Okay. I am advised.
In my estimation, because when we are not able to prove what may follow as lawsuits, and we are going to have to be putting back these young men on the streets in droves. Not necessarily that they were not members of gang or they were not gang leaders, but we weren't able to prove it.
Exactly.
And so that we end up sort of compounding the difficulty that we had before we began this process, and which in itself is a difficulty. How you prove a gang leader? You have to have a gang member, unless you have the raw intelligence, which we don't have. I don't think we do. You have to effectively have a gang member say that this man,
my word versus yours,
and that person would have to probably get exemption from the state as to get how they call it, would have to immunity from the state and the like, and give that evidence, and so that you really have to get gang members saying that this person is a gang member.
We know that,
of course, that presents a real difficulty for the state. So how are we? To me, it's going to be very difficult. we're going to have a lot of problems in prosecuting these matters. I can bet, if I were a betting man, that 95% of these young men would have to go free. They would not be committed. Their matters would be discharged because of the inherent difficulties in the legislation in really proving that they are gang members.
So in essence, as we wrap up this program, or this segment, in essence, what you're saying is, what I'm gathering is that we have two major issues here. One, the legal ramifications of this action.
Yes.
Upon the young men's lives, and two, the application of this law during a state of emergency.
Yes.
Seeing that it was never applied before.
No.
Then the other issue is the sociological aspect of it, in terms of the gang culture is not, or some even argue, and fair enough, the gang cancer is not eliminated, is not gotten rid of. So you're back to square one, or you may be even worse off.
Yeah, we're back to square one. The state of emergency will not fix that, can't fix that. It wasn't designed to fix that. I mean, we've heard it argued that the state of emergency, the framers of the legislation, our founding fathers, the Constitution, it would be that it would not have been in their contemplation that the state of emergency would be used to sort of solve crime, for want of a better word, or to fix crime, or to fix escalating crime. I don't think that it was ever within the contemplation of those who framed the constitutions that the state of emergency would have been used for that purpose.
Yeah.
So that we square pegs in the wrong hole.
Right. So we back to square one. So we have come to the end of this segment, and we trust that you have been educated and informed, and we'll be back in a few. So don't miss it as we continue the program, A Biblical Response to the State of Emergency.